How much has Last Epoch changed in the past 2 years? And for those who have never checked the game out, what is it? Well, starting with the easier to answer question, Last Epoch is an ARPG or action role-playing game that feels a lot like what you'd get if you crossed Grim Dawn with Path of Exile. The game has a lot of unique mechanics which feel fresh and exciting, even in 2023's crowded ARPG market. Now, the game has a long way to go. It's not even out of beta yet, but it has some serious potential. And if you haven't played Last Epoch before, now is the best time to do so, though a little more about why later. Now when I say the game is a bit of a cross between Grim Dawn and Path of Exile, what I mean is the playstyle isn't as slow as D2, Titan Quest, or Grim Dawn, but it's also not as fast as Path of Exile or Torchlight Infinite. In a lot of ways, it tends to hit the middle ground between these two extremes. If it's been a while since you last played Last Epoch, then do be aware that not all of these changes are part of a 0.9 patch. Yes, a lot's changing with 0.9, but a lot has also changed in the past couple of years since I last reviewed the game, so I wanted to go over all of it today. 0.9 is the multiplayer patch. The biggest thing by far is, well, being able to play with your friends. But there's also visual upgrades, gameplay, and many balance changes. So if you haven't played in a couple of years, like I said before, now is absolutely the best time to check the game out again. And since it's the big centerpiece, how is multiplayer in Last Epoch? Right now, it's very easy to play with your friends. Once you're in a party, you can use the blue swirl to teleport to a friend's location from pretty much anywhere, and overall, monoliths are much less punishing, both in terms of progression, but also in terms of beating bosses. So long as one person in your party is alive, you can keep trying. Though every player who dies will still lose rewards, and this progression does not work the same way in dungeons. Another new feature to multiplayer is item gifting. With item gifting, you can easily pass items to your friends, and do neat stuff like craft on an item for someone. Now, while there is item gifting, there's no economy yet. Though for more of my thoughts on trade in Last Epoch, check out my video which will be up in the card and down in the description below that goes into that in much more detail. For a quick summary, there's no trade or economy yet. But during the open beta test of the 0.9 patch, the devs did put out a poll discussing the future of trade in Last Epoch, and they're going to be making more announcements on that in the future. Multiplayer also means a wide variety of builds which wouldn't have otherwise worked are now possible. This can include things like dedicated supports, such as the support character that you can see on screen. That video again will be up in the card. Along with, of course, a carry setup, a build that doesn't do that much damage by itself, but when placed next to a compatible support, absolutely destroys everything. Now, it's extremely easy to play after you're in a party, but it can be a little bit annoying to set up a party with people. Some of which you might have seen is beta bugs, which I'm sure will have been sorted out by the time 0.9 goes live. The other part is, whenever one person from a party loads into an area, everyone else in the party gets a loading screen. In other words, when playing multiplayer in Last Epoch, you should follow the general rule of D&D and never split the party. But what if you don't have any friends? Is Last Epoch for you? Well, Last Epoch works perfectly fine as a solo game. And if you wanted to make some friends, I did see a lot of people looking for group in the game's general chat. But if you've never played Last Epoch before, or if you haven't played in a while, here are some of the most exciting changes that might be interesting to you. And again, remember, this isn't all exclusive to the 0.9 patch. First off, dungeons, where you fight through hordes of enemies, usually with some sort of unique gimmick, and end it with a fairly challenging boss fight. First up, we've got the Temporal Sanctum, which has two major advantages over normal content. The first is that you get a lot of exalted items to drop. The second is you can make legendary items. A legendary is a really good unique, combined with an exalted rare. The number of modifiers that get transferred over depend on the legendary potential, meaning with high enough legendary potential, you can transfer over all four, which make for some incredibly powerful, even game-breaking items. The gimmick of a Temporal Sanctum is time shift, so there's twice as many areas to kill, but that also means the enemy is a maze. Plan accordingly and try to avoid backtracking. Once you reach the end, you'll be fighting Julra, who is pretty anti-melee. Range builds are definitely advisable here, but most builds should be able to do T3 without too much difficulty, and once you get good at a fight, T4 isn't that bad either, even on a melee build. Just don't try to tank the Meteor unless you're really, really tanky. Next up, we have the Lightless Arbor, which is a really thematic area, since the whole place is shrouded in darkness, much like the Delve from Path of Exile, but you carry around a source of eternal light, at least until the enemies hit you, diminishing it. Don't worry, if you take a few hits, you can always kill the gold and elementals all around the map to replenish this light. Now, unlike the Temporal Sanctum, the Lightless Arbor is a very pro-range dungeon, and you can use the flame to burn down obstacles. But if you're going to go in, make sure you have enough gold for the chest at the end. You can keep rolling by spending gold to get more and more loot. This isn't quite as good for items, but can be very good if you're trying to obtain a massive amount of glyphs or runes. And then there's the Soulfire Bastion, the location of the Gambler, and something that seems to be inspired by an obscure Japanese bullet hell game called Ikaruga, where you have two shields, the fire shield that makes you immune to all fire damage, and the necrotic shield that makes you immune to all necrotic damage. This means that some of those abilities will hit incredibly hard and deal lethal amounts, unless of course you just happen to swap your shield at the right time and become completely immune. And once you get to the end, you'll be able to gamble away your hard-earned souls with the Gambler. This is a great way to obtain gear, including exalted and unique items, but unfortunately the animation is kind of long and a skip would be nice. Also, look at his entire stock and plan out your purchases carefully, cause if you make a mistake, you can't go back. Something else that was revamped, at least since I originally played and made my first review, is the crafting system. Back then, your items had a chance to fracture. Once it fractured, you couldn't craft on it anymore. Now you have what's called crafting potential. As you try to add higher tier mods, there's greater risk to your crafting potential, though you can always use a Glyph of Hope to attempt to preserve it. And if you're feeling lucky, you can use a Glyph of Chaos to randomize the modifier. This is great if you have a really good item with one undesirable mod and don't want to risk removing it. Alternatively, there's the Glyph of Despair, which steals a mod, completely locking it into place. It becomes uninteractable, and there's an open mod slot on the item after that. So instead of being limited to 4 mods, now your item can have 5. In addition, you can also use various runes to interact with your items in different ways. A Rune of Creation is a Mirror of Calandra. A Rune of Ascendance turns an item into a unique. And a Rune of Shattering destroys the item to give you crafting shards. Last Epoch's crafting system is quite versatile, and it makes crafting very good endgame gear easy, which means it won't be long until you have perfect 4-mod exalted items in most if not all of your slots. If you really want to grind in the endgame, that's all going to come in the form of legendaries. With all that said, I've talked about the good, and now I'm going to talk about the bad. Because nothing's perfect, and the game is a work in progress. The major complaint I have is that monolith progression still isn't account bound. It's character bound. This means if you want to play a second character, you either need a friend to boost you, or you need to go through all of the normal monoliths, and then all be empowered, and then grind up corruption. This makes the game feel far more alt-unfriendly than it needs to be. Plus, as you're going through, you're not really incentivized to do anything in normal monoliths, because the blessings are of an inferior quality to those you get later, so it just makes the entire experience feel like a waste of time. So it'd be great if monolith progression was shared account-wide. Now the second thing is, there's probably not as much longevity here as a game like Path of Exile. In Path of Exile, you can pretty much spend an endless amount of time polishing your character. You're never quite done, there's always another layer of perfection. In Last Epoch, for most of the game, you can get by without very good gear at all. Toss on a few Exalteds, a unique or two, and you're good to go. Now there is quite a bit of depth and time that can be spent grinding and perfecting your character. But it takes a huge grind to get to that point. It's kind of like how, if in Path of Exile, you needed to get to depth 1000 in the Delve to actually test your character, and the Delve was all account bound. Yes, it exists, but it feels inaccessible to the point where most people don't actually push into content that's challenging, thus finding the gameplay loop to be a little bit repetitive and boring. Though, if you like playing alts, then there's still going to be plenty here for you, and if you do make it past that hump, there's definitely a lot of challenge to be found. And finally, certain masteries feel overly restrictive in terms of which builds work and which builds don't work. A good example of this is where Marksman's only real identity is, I'm the character that uses the bow, but unfortunately a lot of elements of Rogue's other mastery, Blade Dancer, kind of overlap with that, being a ranged damage dealer that has access to much better defensive options, and in many cases better offensive options as well. This isn't to say there aren't powerful builds on Marksman. Some of the most powerful builds in the game's history have been on Marksman, but it feels like your creativity is a little bit restricted, as opposed to a class like Paladin that can be used for attack builds, spell builds, support builds, and much more. So do keep in mind that while there is a very strong sense of class fantasy with some characters, your build choices might be a little limited as a result. Now all that said, if you haven't played Last Epoch in a while, I strongly advise coming back from a 0.9 patch to see what the game's about. And if you've never played Last Epoch before, this is a great time to check it out. Personally, I always advocate that you should buy a game for what it is, not what it may someday be. And Last Epoch is well worth the money for what it is right now. If you want to purchase the game, while also helping to support the channel, you can do so down below using my Nexus link. And if you're looking for a build to play, something that's fast, strong, and feels amazing, check out my cast-on-hit smite hammerdin. I played this build during the multiplayer patch testing, and it feels absolutely incredible. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's the best build I ever played in Last Epoch. So overall, it feels like the game's in a great place. There's a good mix of endgame content between dungeons and monoliths, even if monolith progression not carrying over between alts is a little bit awkward. In comparison to when I first tried the game 2 years ago, the animations and general feel of skills is much better. Everything both looks and feels much more polished. Plus, if you like playing with friends, you can absolutely group up with them. Many of my previous annoyances with the crafting system have not only been resolved, but now there's a lot of really cool min-maxing you can do, like sealing away a bad affix with a Glyph of Despair, or maybe re-rolling it entirely using a Glyph of Chaos. And things like having a support build or getting a boost from friends make the endgame feel that much better. Moving from 0.9 to the full release of Last Epoch, it's going to be interesting to see what EHG continues to change. Personally, I'm looking forward to seeing what all of the other masteries are. I'm curious how they're going to handle trade, and I'm also wondering, what is the future of content going to look like in Last Epoch? Are we going to see a game like Path of Exile that lives or dies based on a fairly short content cycle of a week of hype, then a couple weeks of gameplay? Or are we going to see something more along the lines of an older ARPG where there's big expansions that everyone gets excited for, people play for a few months, maybe a year, and then hype dies down until the next big expansion comes out? 2023 is a rough year to be releasing a major patch for an ARPG. We have Diablo 4, maybe some news on Path of Exile 2, not to mention the fact that Lost Ark's still going strong, and Torchlight Infinite is providing competition while also expanding the ARPG genre into the mobile market in a way that Diablo Immortal never could. And then there's Last Epoch. Will the game manage to leave a mark, or will it quietly fade away, forgotten by all but the hardcore fans? Personally, I hope it doesn't fade away, because the genre can always use more competition, and there's a lot of really cool ideas here. But what do you think? Have you tried Last Epoch before? And if so, are these changes going to bring you back? If not, what would it take? Let me know some of those thoughts down in the comments below. And remember, if you haven't tried Last Epoch before, be sure to use my Nexus link to pick the game up while supporting the channel. Before I go, a big thanks to EHG for inviting me to be part of their multiplayer invitational where I got to see the 0.9 content for myself. And of course, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. If you want something else to watch, YouTube will have a recommendation on screen right now. Or you can go up into the card or down in the description below to check out my other recent Last Epoch videos, including that smite hammerdin, my thoughts on trade, and the best way to make a loot filter for any build. That's all for me today. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.